My name is Mark McGuinness, and this is the 21st Century Creative, the podcast that helps you thrive as a creative professional amid the demands, the distractions, and the opportunities of the 21st century. Welcome to episode 2 of season 3, which is going out on Christmas Eve. And I have a very special stocking filler for you today, one of the most interesting interviews I have ever recorded about the creative process. And I'm going to invite you to leave your preconceptions at the door for this one, because when I tell you that my guest, Tyler Hobbs, creates art by writing computer programs, some of you may not be so keen on that idea. It might sound a bit cold and cerebral. Well, if that's your initial reaction, then you're in for a pleasant surprise, because Tyler's art is anything but cold and intellectual. You can see some of Tyler's pictures in the show notes at 21stcenturycreative.fm/Tyler. And I encourage you to listen to what he says with an open mind. I have a couple of news items today about previous guests on the show. In season 2, I had a great interview with Patricia van den Akker of the Design Trust in London about creating a business you are proud of. And you might like to know that Patricia's Dream Plan Do planners for 2019 are now available. These are beautifully designed and printed journals that help you plan the year ahead for your creative business. They include lots of exercises and beautifully laid out planning tools to help you dream big and track your progress through the year. They always sell out quickly, but I believe there are still some available for 2019, so you can get one at dream-plan-do.com. Another great interview in season 2 was with Daniel Betcher of the Intrepid Wendell Jewellery Salon. Daniel and his team have recently launched a blog at theintrepidwendell.com, and that's Wendell, Wendell, and an Instagram feed at The Intrepid Wendell. So do check those out. Not only for the gorgeous photos of the beautiful Wendell creations, but also for the stories behind them. Dan is a very thoughtful and creative guy, and there's always a story and a special meaning behind every piece of jewellery he creates. Okay, that's it for this week's news. There is great excitement in our house today. The children are, of course, beside themselves with anticipation of Santa. Later on, I will continue the family tradition handed on from my dad, who's an opera fan, of playing the opening of La Bohème, where there's a group of bohemian friends waiting for Christmas in their garret. And it's so cold, one of them has to burn the script of his play to keep warm. So it always feels like Christmas when I play that scene. And whether or not you officially celebrate Christmas, I wish you and yours peace and joy this week. And before we get too jolly, I have a few words to say about the surprisingly creative power of envy. Have you ever found yourself looking at one of the rising stars in your field and thinking, what's so special about them? My work's at least as good as theirs. Why are they getting all the attention? It's not a nice feeling, is it? No wonder envy is one of the 7 deadly sins. Imagine the misery of living your whole life in this state. But envy is also an opportunity. If you respond to it the right way, it's a gift. Because envy is telling you what you want. Why does desire show up as envy? Sometimes it's because you're working flat out to create the future you want, and you haven't made it happen yet. But If you find yourself being surprised by envy, it's probably a sign of suppressed desire. It's telling you you've lost your way a little. You've forgotten what you really want, and you're settling for second best. This kind of envy is that suppressed or forgotten desire raising its head again and looking at someone else and telling you, look, that's what you want. Wouldn't it be great to be the one doing that? I was surprised by envy a few years ago. I was in the audience at a poetry reading and found myself envious of the poets on stage and hypercritical of their poems and their delivery. I could do better than that, was the thought that went through my mind. Then I asked myself, so why aren't you doing it? At that moment, I realized I'd been sidelining my own poetry. I had plenty of excuses, of course. I was too busy, I had other things on my plate, I'd get to it someday. But when I looked at it honestly, I realized I could make room for poetry if I gave up other things. And behind all the busyness and excuses, I realized there was a big fear lurking. What if I couldn't do better than that? Well, there was only one way to find out. It was time to start writing again, in earnest. Next time you find yourself envying someone else, even if it's a nasty surprise, take a deep breath and congratulate yourself. Because you just unearthed a big desire, maybe a big ambition. And now you have the opportunity to make it happen. Ask yourself, what do they have that I want for myself? What are they doing that I would like to be doing? How did they get there? And most importantly, what can I start doing today that will set me on the path I want to follow? When you set out on a creative career, you won't find any of the usual milestones of success. Unlike your friends who enter traditional jobs with clear routes to promotion, finely calibrated pay grades, and impressive job titles, there's no career ladder for people like you and me. And there are no clear markers to indicate your progress. If you compare yourself to your friends, it can be easy to feel left behind as they climb higher and higher from promotion to promotion. It's obvious to all the world that their career is going somewhere. Whereas for you, on a bad day, it can feel like you don't have a clue where you're headed. So how can you chart your course and set yourself up for long-term success as a creative? This is the question at the heart of a short book I've written to accompany this podcast. It's called 21 Insights for 21st Century Creatives. The insights are designed to help you stay true to yourself and your inspiration amid the demands and distractions of 21st century life. They will also help you to win on your own terms by adopting a strategy for success that has nothing to do with the conventional career ladder. And I'm giving you the ebook edition for free. To pick up your free copy of 21 Insights for 21st Century Creatives, go to 21stcenturycreative.fm/21insights and download it right away. A few months ago, I was talking to a friend who suggested I check out the artwork of Tyler Hobbs as an example of generative art. It turns out that there's a whole subculture of artists and programmers using computer code to create original art, which they call generative art. It sounded like an interesting idea, but I didn't have any great expectations of the art itself. Then I landed on Tyler's website, and I was entranced by what I saw. There was definitely a futuristic, computerized look and feel to the images, but they also had an evocative, even haunting quality. The atmosphere of the artworks reminded me of some of my favorite ambient and techno music, or science fiction movies like Blade Runner and Metropolis. I was also intrigued to see that quite a few images were marked sold and unavailable. You see, instead of creating an image and printing it multiple times, Tyler is creating one-off original artworks. And when a collector buys the work, Tyler ships the image with a copy of the program used to create it. The more I looked, the more absorbing Tyler's images became. I was also intrigued by his writings about generative art and creativity. And questions kept popping into my mind. How exactly do you make this kind of art? Why go to the trouble of writing a program instead of drawing it or using Photoshop to create the images you want? How do you create such emotionally compelling images by writing computer code? What can generative art tell us about the future of art? In the end, I emailed Tyler and asked if he would come on the show so I could ask him these questions and share the answers with you. He kindly agreed, and he gave me a fascinating and very insightful interview. Not only did I learn a lot about Tyler's artistic process, I also found plenty of things I could relate to in my own practice as a poet. If you love futuristic art, or if you're curious about the intersection of technology and human creativity, I'm sure you'll find this conversation as riveting as I did. And if you think computer art sounds a bit cold and cerebral, then I think you'll be pleasantly surprised to hear what Tyler has to say about technology, emotions, and creativity in the brave new world of generative art. You'll get a lot more out of this interview if you look at some of Tyler's art as well as listening to him talk. So you can see some of his images in the show notes at 21stcenturycreative.fm/Tyler. And there are lots more images at Tyler's website, which is tylerlhobbs.com. And that's Hobbs with a double B. Tyler, what exactly is generative art?
Well, generative art is, it can be a little bit tricky to explain sometimes, but kind of the core of generative art is that it's pattern and process based. So in the current day, you're typically going to be creating artwork through program if you're making generative artwork. So um, for myself, my artwork is created entirely through programming. I don't draw things by hand or use any sort of Photoshop or uh,
Mhm.
post editing in any of my work. There's a few exceptions to that, but largely it's done through custom computer programming. So I sit down and I develop a custom algorithm that will generate an image, usually with no sort of input. So it's working from a blank state. So that's kind of the best description of how generative art is typically created these days.
So there's no kind of direct manipulation like with a Photoshop or a mouse or a brush or a scanned image. It's you're writing lines of code that then generate the image. Is that right?
Precisely. Yeah, a lot of people, um, they sort of whenever they see digital artwork, it's hard for them to imagine not having interacted with it directly. But yeah, with generative artwork, you really give up a certain amount of control because you're working through a program. And it's also important to point out that typically with generative artwork, you're not working towards a single image per se. You're developing a program that has kind of the characteristics to where, on average, the images that it outputs will look pretty good. So you're kind of specifying a whole set of aesthetic preferences and patterns in a system rather than developing one specific image.
So is this why on your website you've got a series of similar looking images?
Exactly. Yeah. The programs that I create tend to involve a lot of randomness, and the randomness is used very carefully and very deliberately. I might use it um, anywhere from kind of the high level structure of the image in terms of how large forms and shapes are placed and organized, all the way down to very fine details. Um, kind of little random rough edges and splatters and things like that. Uh, I also use randomness for colors and color selection. So every time that I run the program, I get a different output. And that allows me to do one kind of special thing, which is, I can offer multiple images from the same program at a little bit of a lower cost to keep uh, my artwork affordable.
Okay, so this is interesting. You run the program and then there's a random element within that. So, when we use the phrase pre-program, we tend to think of it as something as being predefined. But for you, the program is actually a way of kind of scrambling that and giving up control.
Absolutely, absolutely. The the randomness is I mentioned that the randomness was used very carefully. It's kind of the randomness turns the program into a set of guidelines rather than an exact description of an image.
Hmm.
So the randomness both helps me to give up control to some extent and allow things to happen maybe a bit more naturally, um, and it also helps for exploration. When you give up some of that control, the randomness will sometimes present new ideas that I wouldn't have considered otherwise. So it's definitely an ally in the process.
Okay, but we're talking randomness rather than artificial intelligence. You wouldn't say you're creating an AI and using that.
Yeah, definitely. AI is a very different sort of beast from what I'm doing. My programs are relatively simple compared to what AI does. My program doesn't. So AI, kind of, it's trying to build some sort of rough understanding of the problem that it's working on in some
Yeah.
sense. And my program, um, has none of that sort of memory or understanding that an AI sort of has.
And what drew you to generative art rather than the more traditional kind?
It was an interesting development. So I've always really enjoyed drawing and painting, and did that for quite a few years, and you know studied traditional portrait drawing and figure drawing and landscapes for quite a few years. But I also went to university to study computer science. So I had a very strong computer programming background, and I was doing that as a day job at that point. And um, I kind of had this awareness that artists are best served by trying to utilize things that are unique to them or that are part of their character or their life experience. And so you try and bring everything to the table that you can when you're working on artwork. And for me, it became pretty clear that I should try to involve the computer or programming in some way. And it was that did not immediately lead me to generative artwork. I mean, some of my first attempts to kind of link the two were laughably bad, but eventually I got the idea that maybe I could write a program that would generate a painting, and that was sort of the
Hmm.
mindset that I had when I first started making generative artwork. A couple of months after that, I started to stumble upon, you know, the generative art community and learn that it was sort of already a thing. Um, and I very quickly figured out that this was something that was going to work well for me, and I've been pursuing it since then.
So you actually came up with the idea and then you realized that other people had developed it independently.
Absolutely, and they were doing a much better job than I was doing at the time.
So, okay, tell us about the generative art scene. I'd never heard of it until I came across your work. How big is it? Who's in it? What kind of range of work is in it?
Yeah, it's an interesting scene. It's not that large, and it never has been that large. Generative art has been around since the late '60s, with some of the earliest computers, usually in kind of a military or scientific establishment. They were the first generative artists came out of that, and it's it's never really caught on. Kind of the normal art scene hasn't been a huge fan of it, um, and it's kind of just been a weird side project that some programmers have done in their spare time. These days, it is picking up a bit more, and I think that's primarily because of a couple of reasons. One is that the tools are much more accessible. So thanks to things like open source software, there are a lot better and more readily available tools for anybody to start playing around with creating generative artwork. And I think the other development is that kind of as a consequence of that, or as a consequence of more people having programming experience, we start to get kind of more artists that also know how to program in the mix, and they're starting to um, change what gets created these days. So um, generative art, I do feel like it's going through a nice uptick, but it's still a very small community.
Okay, and people are coming at it from both sides. There's the programmers who are thinking, "Hey, we could use this to make images," and then there's artists who, I guess, whatever art form we have these days, but more and more we're using some kind of digital electronic technology to facilitate or record or publish that. So it's kind of converging from both sides.
Absolutely. I would say it's still usually dominated by programmers deciding to play around with doing something a little bit more fun with programming than their normal day job allows them to do. But there have always been artists that have kind of stumbled into this arena as well. So one of the most well-known generative artists is a guy by the name of Manfred Moore, and he was kind of one of the early pioneers, and he was an artist that kind of entered the space, and he had a very different approach from the programmers, and so um, uh, you know it brings a totally different mindset, and which I think is an awesome and very positive thing. Um, so yeah, people are kind of attacking it from both ends.
And do you need to be able to code? I mean, if I'm a painter listening to this, thinking, "Wow, I'd like to get into that, but I don't know how to write code," is that going to be a big barrier to entry for me?
I would say that coding makes a very big difference. There are ways to do it without coding. There are some environments that um, are really a sort of a type of programming, but maybe in a more visual style rather than textual controls. You have kind of visual controls. So
Hmm.
that's one option for people who don't know how to program. Another is that, and maybe we'll talk about this a little bit later, but some elements of generative artwork don't really, it doesn't strictly require programming, and you could manually produce some similar results. But um, I got to tell you, programming is such a powerful tool um, that it makes a huge difference if you do know how to program. Even if you just know how to program a little bit, it's honestly not super complicated programming. You don't have to be a mathematician or have a computer science degree in order to do it. It's relatively simple, and but there's kind of a when you're working through programming, there's a much more natural dialogue between yourself and the computer. You're kind of speaking on the in the computer's terms, and something about working that way helps. I think helps to explore the possibilities of generative art more fully and more naturally.
So, do you enjoy writing code, like in the way a novelist, for instance, might enjoy writing prose?
Yeah, I would say it's pretty similar. I'd say probably novelists have parts of their book that just kind of flow out easily, and then they have other parts where they get stuck and have to think about exactly what to write very carefully for a week straight. I have those same sorts of experience with code. Most of the time, it comes out pretty naturally. I've been writing code for a long time, and so it's a pretty natural way for me to
Hmm.
already be thinking about the problem. But yeah, every once in a while there are the thorny problems as well. It's tough to think about how to write the code correctly. Sometimes it's hard to translate uh, kind of a visual idea into a program, to think about how you might kind of build that up from patterns and processes. But yeah, the actual act of writing code is it feels good to me. I'm definitely I definitely get in the zone when I'm working on these programs.
I mean, do you think there could be an analogy with music? I mean, I'm not a musician, so it's always pretty amazing to me to watch a trained musician just pick up a piece of equipment and the technical ability that they've got and the muscle memory and so on. To them, it's invisible because it's so finely honed that they're just focused on their emotional expression through the instrument.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of similarities between the two, and I would say it's most similar actually to composing rather than playing an instrument,
Well, okay, yeah.
because there's sort of there's a level of freedom that you're giving up where the final product maybe won't be exactly what you have in mind. So the composer probably hears their score in a certain way in their head, and then whenever the orchestra actually plays it, things might end up sounding quite a bit different. So there's that sort of difference. The other is that, at least I'm imagining, I do play some music, but I'm definitely not a real composer. I have to imagine that they kind of hear everything working together at once in their head sometimes, and then they have to kind of carefully think about how to break that down into individual parts and patterns and components that will add up to what they're looking for. And there's a lot of similarity in that to how I think about building up a visual image through different elements of a program.
Coming back to the analogy with the score and the composer, it strikes me maybe you could think of the score as being software code for the orchestra.
Absolutely, yeah, that's exactly what it is. Yeah, there's a certain amount of flexibility in that score that's open for interpretation, and some composers, especially in the maybe postmodern era of music, have intentionally left a lot of ambiguity in the score,
Mhm.
and I do exactly the same thing in my program. The ambiguity is there very intentionally.
And, staying with the idea of intention and randomness and unpredictability, do you start off with an image in your mind that you think, okay, I'm going to write a piece of code to produce that? Or is it more open ended that you write a piece of code and see what comes out?
Yeah, I would say it's much more like the latter. I I certainly never have a finished image in mind whenever I'm first beginning a program. Um, at best, I kind of have a technique that I know I want to experiment with, or maybe I've you know just wrote another program that turned out pretty well, and I have an idea for how I can change that. But for me, it's a very exploratory process, and the medium really lends itself to that well. So I can, you know, start out by writing a very simple program. I can run it very quickly, see what the output looks like, and if I like it or don't like it, I can go back and change the program and run it again accordingly. So, the output is very mutable. So it's really easy for me to experiment with new things. And if I don't like it, I can roll back the changes pretty easily. And that's not something that every medium has. So I really try to take advantage of that by working in a very exploratory and open-minded way. However, I will say, um, as far as individual changes to the program go, say you know, uh, I want to make a certain visual change to the program. I usually have a pretty good idea about what needs to happen in the code uh, to correspond to that type of visual change. So at this point, I've definitely developed a sense of if I change the program a certain way, this is what it will likely look like. But it's also easy to kind of escape that realm, and for me to change the code in a way that I have no idea what's going to come out, and I'll try that just to see if it happens to be amazing.
So when the image comes out, it's a surprise to you.
Yes, it's a surprise to a certain extent. Sometimes it's a really big surprise. Sometimes it's along the lines of what I expect, but I never could have predicted all of the details that are in there.
So what's that moment like when you, I mean, how do you first see it? Does it flash up on the screen or does it come out of the printer or?
Yeah, it flashes up on the screen, and that moment uh, that moment can be very exciting. There have definitely been a lot of moments where I make a change, not knowing what the output's going to be, and I see the result, and suddenly I know where this piece is going. Like it's the aha moment, it clicks when I see that image, and since a lot of my work kind of begins by stumbling around in the dark, there's usually that kind of one critical change that really puts the I see it, and then I know what the structure of the work needs to be like. So yeah, I love that kind of surprise element of creating the work.
You see, and I think probably somebody listening to this, whatever their art form is, can almost certainly relate to that. And because, when you think about creating artwork from computer code, I think the initial response that a lot of artists might have is, well, isn't that a bit cold? Isn't it a bit cerebral? Isn't it a bit programmatic in the bad sense? But what you're describing is very familiar to me as a poet. Sometimes you change something and, oh, or a line comes in or a rhyme pops out and the whole thing looks different. And there's that. I mean, I had the poet Mimi Calvati on last season talking about poetry as discovery. She said, if you know what you're going to write, then it won't be a poem, but you go in and you surprise yourself. And what you're describing, I think, is that kind of aha moment that's probably familiar to creators in all kinds of different fields.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think if you're not going into the work with an open mind about what it can be, then you're really limiting yourself in terms of you're not trusting your intuitive response, right? You're kind of the pre-planning of a work is a lot more cerebral, and um, when you're actually in the middle of that work, allowing yourself to respond to it and change it as it develops, based on how your soul or your spirit reacts to the work. Um, that's going to give you you know a lot better result, I think. And yeah, I try to do a generative art the same way. I mean, there's definitely, like you say, it is kind of a very it sounds like a very cold, logical form of artwork, and I can certainly see how people see it that way, and how creators can kind of fall into that trap when they're getting started with it. Um, so it's you have to learn to not have such a firm grasp on everything, and allow yourself to explore and allow yourself to react to things, and just take directions based on your gut reaction.
Right. And this was my initial response when I first saw your work was just, wow, it's so beautiful and it's so evocative. And there's some really haunting imagery in there. And I think, I read an article on your site where you talk about the importance of evoking an emotional response in generative art. I'll link to it in the show notes and you're quite critical of the generative art scene because you say a lot of it is too cerebral, too intellectual. Can you say a bit more about how on earth do you get that emotion, that level of emotion into something that computer generated and programmed in this way?
Yeah, I think just to kind of expand on what you were saying, it's you know given that a lot of the people creating this form of artwork do have a an engineering background, a math background, maybe a computer science background, um, we're very used to and trained to think in a series of logical, clearly defined steps. And as artists know, that's not something that really tends to work well for artwork. Art is it has to be sort of guided by your interior feelings, your internal response to the artwork. And in that article, I'm kind of trying to push generative artists to listen more to that internal voice, and in my own work, that's something that I try very hard to do. I try to base my judgment and decisions around the work entirely on what my internal reaction is. So, you know, if it evokes some sort of an interesting emotional response in me, that's something I want to try and follow. And if the work doesn't do that for me, if it's just kind of a technical display or something like that, then I know that it's kind of failed at becoming a meaningful piece of artwork. And it's really easy with something like generative artwork to get wrapped up in the technical aspect of it, to kind of show off your technical chops. And I mean, a lot of forms of artwork are that way. Certainly, I know for drawing and painting, it's easy to get pulled into that trap as well. But I think it's always worth it to take that challenge of moving to the next level beyond just technical abilities, and really try to focus on the emotional response, and in particular your own emotional response to the work. And at least that's my strategy.
The poet Robert Frost once said, "No tears in the writer, no tears in the reader," which is to say, if you're not moved by the writing as you write it yourself, then how on earth is your reader going to be moved? So for you, it's got to have that emotional reaction for you when you first see that image. Otherwise, it's just not interesting to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I think the only emotional reaction that you can really gauge honestly and accurately is your own as well. So, you know,
Mm-hmm.
even your best friends might say, I love the work, but you don't really know for certain if it resonates for them, and if it does resonate, exactly how it resonates for them. And so, just out of pure practicality as well, you have to use your own emotional reaction as a guide, because it's the only thing that you've got, a really clear signal from.
Okay, Tyler, you've given us a really fascinating insight into the process. Let's talk a bit about the end result. What is it that you produce as the artifact? Are these like a series of prints, or is it a one-off artwork in its own right?
Yeah, so I typically execute the work through prints, but I prefer to do single edition prints. So I never print the same image more than one time. And
Mm-hmm.
I kind of talked earlier about how randomness allows me to generate multiple different images from the same program. So sometimes as kind of an in between, I'll take one program and generate four different images from it, and so I can sell those for a lower price than if I could only sell one image from the program. Um, I also really like to try to work through non print mediums as well. So something that's a lot of fun to work with is a pen plotter. So for your listeners who may not be aware,
And for me.
and for you, um, a pen plotter, it's a really simple robot. It's kind of a two-axis drawing robot,
Mm-hmm.
and so you stick a pen in it. You give it instructions, um, for lines to draw, and it kind of carries out the whole drawing for you. And of course, this has very different properties from working with a print. Like you can't kind of paint over things when you're talking about a plotter, and you have to be careful about parts of the drawing not going off of the image. But that gives you kind of a real world grittiness that you don't get in a print. there's something kind of cool about that. Um, Lately, I've been experimenting with doing something similar, except putting a paintbrush into the plotter instead and having it
Hmm.
periodically dip that brush into paint. So plotter paintings is another thing that I've been working on. Um, and of course, I have the option of doing, displaying art with digital displays or a projector. Um, but um typically, I prefer the experience and the appearance of a print over, um, a digitally projected image.
Okay, so most of the time, the end result is what looks like a print that you would hang on the wall
Exactly.
in your home. And did I see somewhere that you include the code when you sell the artwork?
Yeah, absolutely. That's correct. I don't typically publish my code, um,
Hmm.
but I do feel like it's an important component of the artwork. Whenever somebody takes the time to appreciate my artwork and purchases a piece, I feel like they deserve to know and maybe understand a little bit about the process that went into creating that image. Um, Especially because the image is just one potential output of billions from this program. So
Yeah.
it's kind of a small snapshot of the program. Um, and so yeah, I consider the program to be an important part of the artwork, and so I include a copy of that along with the artwork with any sales.
That's something Turner never offered, right?
No,
So, I mean, we've talked a lot about technology, and it's all quite futuristic. What about artists from the past? Are there any artists that you would say have been a big influence on you, or do you see yourself as the latest, iteration of any kind of tradition from the past?
there are definitely older traditional influences on me. I really enjoy a lot of abstract expressionist and
Hmm.
color filled paintings. That's kind of what I tend to emotionally react to, and so I feel like I try to capture some of the spirit of that in my work. But there definitely is a lineage of generative art at this point, and um, I would say there's a few early kind of progenitors of that. Dada, in some ways, you could say played a role in it because Dada started to integrate the use of randomness.
Hmm.
John Cage used randomness when composing some of his scores.
Hmm.
Um, and Later on, an artist by the name Saul LeWitt started to create work that was simply a set of instructions. So like three or four very simple instructions for how to execute a drawing on a wall, and um, this is sort of a form of early generative artwork that's not executed by a computer; it's executed by a human instead. But the idea is the same. It's a simple process or pattern that, if you follow it, results in the creation of an interesting piece of artwork. So I feel like I fall in that same lineage, and I'm just trying to. If I'm successful with my work, I hope to have expanded the emotional range of a generative artwork a little bit.
And where do you see this going? I mean, what's your sense of what the future of generative art might be, or the the future of art and technology?
Well, I could speculate for a really long time on that front, but there's a lot of really interesting things in the pipeline. So one of them, and of course, new technology always has a big impact on artwork, and that's definitely the case with generative artwork as well. So a couple of the new technologies that I think will produce some very interesting artwork. One is VR, virtual reality,
Hmm.
and I think what could be really cool to see would be sort of generative 3D sculpture in a VR environment. So um, yeah, it's I mean, then so the key distinction between sculpture in the real world and sculpture in VR is that you don't have physical limitations anymore. You don't have to think about
Yeah.
the weight of things or the scale of things, and generative artwork doesn't have to be in 2D; it can be in 3D as well. And I think it would be really interesting to see people explore that space of generating large scale 3D sculptures that you can walk around and interact with in virtual reality. I have no doubt that will be a thing soon enough. And if I was a 3D sort of person, that's what I would be doing. Um, another another technology that's going to have a really big impact and is already producing some interesting results is um, something called deep learning. And this is kind of one piece of what you might call AI. It's one particular
Hmm.
technique for teaching a program something to learn something deep and structural about images in a way that it can also generate um, images based on kind of its what it's seen in the past. So, you may have seen, or some of your listeners may have seen, Google released something called the Deep Dream um, software, and you can kind of make it hallucinate these images that have like they're filled with kind of eyes and like dogs' faces, and they're very very colorful. And um, I don't know if you've seen this in particular, but
I haven't, but I'll make sure if we can find a link, I'll make sure I link to it in the show notes if you want to
yeah,
go and
it, it
experience it for
was
yourself.
it was very popular when it came out, and I'm sure some of your listeners will know what I'm referring to. So that's kind of one of the first steps in that. But really, the key development is that the programs are starting to understand images in a more structural way. So they don't quite know this, but they have a sense of this is an eye. This is what eyes sort of look like. This is what the range of what an eye might
Uh-huh.
potentially look like. And so if you sort of ask it to you know generate an image of an eye or generate an image of a face, it'll get all the components mostly there and mostly the right place. And so it's starting to produce some really um, interesting artifacts. And right now, it's more kind of in the tool building stage right now. But I have no doubt that some really good artists will get their hands on that and produce some really interesting work in the next 5 years.
And just to take that idea for a walk, I mean, if we were to extrapolate from that to AI, producing artwork independently, so it was just the AI was generating it and there were no human interactions. Do you think that could conceivably be as moving as a piece created by a human? I mean, circling back to what we were saying about your own artwork, that emotional appeal of it, it sounds like it comes from the fact that when you see it, it moves you first of all, and then you will select and put that out there. Do you think humans could find AI generated art as moving as that, or would it inevitably lose something?
That's an incredibly deep question, Mark. That's it's going to be a tough one, but I have some thoughts on this.
Oh, good, good.
Um, so I think an important limitation of AI as it is right now is that it can only see and remember what somebody has trained it with. So AI
Yeah.
is very much influenced right now by what data set it's being fed in initially. And so in that way, the person who's developing or controlling the AI has a very large impact on what it produces. So AI is very far from being independent right now. So let's imagine a future where an AI lives in a robot and it can go around and collect its own physical images and sensory input, and it's kind of working based on that. I think it's going to be really tough for an AI to produce artwork if we define artwork as being, it's always hard to define artwork, but if we define artwork as kind of being about the human experience in some way,
Hmm.
then just from that definition, I don't think an AI is going to be able to create truly new artwork just because it doesn't experience and won't experience the world and life in the same way that a human does. But maybe the AI can very successfully create artwork that is meaningful to itself or to other similar AI. And in that case, it might be a very successful artist. But yeah, it's going to be really interesting if this stuff develops, to see what an AI's idea of artwork is once they can move beyond kind of the mimicry as the main operation. So I have no idea what that's going to look like or how successful it might be, but I think it'll give us some interesting insight into ourselves and how AI might fundamentally be different from humans.
Okay, let's leave that thought hanging out there in the future, and we'll come to it with the progress of technology someday. Let's come right back to the present and today, and to what our listener can do based on the ideas that you've been putting across in today's interview. I mean, it's time for the creative challenge. And this one was maybe more challenging than some, given that clearly we're not going to go and ask you to start learning computer code and writing it this week. But I think Tyler's come up with quite an elegant solution to how we can all get a little bit of taste of generative art. So what's your challenge, Tyler?
Yeah, so my challenge is, like Mark said, I don't think it's reasonable to expect people to learn programming just for a challenge like this, but you can really get the spirit of generative artwork by working through patterns and processes and potentially involving randomness. So my challenge would be for your listeners to try to create a simple, small set of instructions that, if you follow them, will result in a piece of artwork being created. So this is sort of like what Saul LeWitt's work was. And maybe I'll give you a couple of examples. So, if I was going to write some instructions to produce a drawing, I might say something like, step one, draw a triangle. Step two, split the triangle in half by adding a new line. Step three, repeat from step one for each of the new triangles you produce until the lines get so small you can't fit any more in. So there I've created a program in some sense. There's only 3 instructions, but it sort of loops back on itself, and I can continue doing it until I've produced an interesting result. And you'll notice that the instructions are kind of ambiguous. The person executing it has quite a bit of leeway as to what type of triangle they draw, how they split it in half exactly. And so there's a lot of interesting variation that might come out of the result as well. So to give you kind of a different example, you might be able to produce a poem with a certain set of instructions. And I'm not a poet, so tell me how good or bad this idea might sound. But
I'm all ears.
So you might use things like, so if we can introduce some randomness here, it might be interesting to say, I've seen some very simple poems or simple rules in poems. Maybe you've seen these same ones where each successive line has one fewer character or syllable than the line above it. That might be a very simple rule that you can kind of repeat as you work on the poem. You might also be able to include an instruction with some randomness, like each line has to begin with a randomly selected adjective, for example, or maybe you can come up with a rule about something about the grammatical structure of each line or the rhythm of each line. I'm not a poet, so it's hard for me to think in that line.
There's a whole catalogue of verse forms. You think about, as you're describing this, I'm thinking, well, I guess the Petrarchan sonnet is a kind of generative art, because it's like, well, it's got to have 14 lines, and there's the first 8 lines have to put together a proposition, and then the last 6 have to answer it, and the rhyme has to go in a certain pattern and whatever. So, gosh,
Yeah,
maybe I've been doing generative art all along.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's a lot more in common with other forms of artwork than you might think. Um,
And it also reminds me of my friend Mick DeLapp when we were working on Magma Poetry Magazine together. He published some poems based on the Fibonacci sequence,
mm,
where the number of syllables in each line was in I don't know what
yeah, the
I'm
Fibonacci
sure by
sequence.
heart. Yeah, but you take
Yeah,
the numbers of that, and then it's the number of syllables in each line. And
yeah,
of course,
yeah.
it gets longer and longer as it goes on, and there's quite an interesting result. So, yeah, I guess maybe we are more generative than we realize.
Yeah, and I think you'll hear a lot of artists say that constraints yield creativity,
Absolutely.
and um, generative art is kind of a way of thinking very carefully about those constraints. And so
Okay,
my hope is that your listeners will self-impose some interesting constraints and maybe come out with some neat results.
this is great, Tyler. So, just to sum up, as I understand it, it's to write a simple set of instructions or rules to produce a piece of art, and it could be in any medium.
Exactly.
And maybe is it something that you execute yourself, or could you give the instructions to someone else, or could it be either?
Yeah, I mean, it'd be really interesting if you gave those instructions to somebody else. I mean, I think that would that would put you, if you're writing the instructions for yourself, you maybe have a certain idea about how to execute them,
Yeah.
and it'd be really interesting to see how somebody else interpreted those and how it differed from your expectations, and that would let you know if your instructions were actually, really good or not. So, I would highly encourage having somebody else execute it if you can find somebody that'll do that for you.
So listen, if anybody does this and you want to share the results, then maybe you could paste them or a link in the comments to the show notes, because we'd be really interested to see what you come up with. So if you go to 21stcenturycreative.fm/Tyler, Tyler, and leave a comment there, we would really love to see what you come up with. I think that would be very, very interesting.
Yeah, that'd be fascinating.
Tyler, thank you. This has been absolutely fascinating for me, and I'm sure for the listeners as well. Where can we go to find more about you and your work online? Is it tylerhobbs.com is your website? Is that right?
It's Tyler L. Hobbs, just the letter
Okay.
L there in
Okay.
the middle. TYLERLHOBBS. Um, so if you just Google Tyler Hobbs, you'll find my website as well. That has a link to my Instagram, which is where I tend to post a lot of images.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you're interested in some of my writings about generative artwork, I have those on my website as well.
Yeah, it's really worth it. I mean, it's mesmerizing to go and browse through Tyler's site and then read the articles. And people can buy prints direct from the site as well, can't they?
That's correct.
Right. And the Instagram as well, I heartily recommend to see the latest stuff that Tyler is doing. So, Tyler, thank you so much. This has been an absolutely fascinating journey, and we really appreciate you taking the time for this.
Yeah, Mark, thank you. I mean, I'm glad that more people are starting to hear about some of the ideas behind generative artwork and find it exciting. So I really appreciate you having me on and letting me talk about my favorite subject for a while.
Great. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise.
You have been listening to the 21st Century Creative, hosted by me, Mark McGuinness. You can find the notes for today's show with more information about my guest and links to the sites we mentioned, as well as all the archived episodes at 21stcenturycreative.fm. If you enjoyed the show, then I hope you'll subscribe in iTunes, and I'm always grateful for your reviews, and also for sharing the show with your friends and followers. If you'd like to have the 21st Century Creative Foundation course delivered to you for free, giving you 26 lessons of advice and worksheets on carving out an original creative career, you can sign up at 21stcenturycreative.fm/free course. And if you are an experienced creative interested in getting my help as a private coaching client, You can learn about how I help my clients at 21stcenturycreative.fm/coaching. Thank you for listening. I hope you'll join me again soon.